So again, we are in the book of Proverbs. It is not often that we have the author of the material that we are studying with us, but we do today. So if we ever have a question about what Dave meant by what he's talking about, we can ask him what he meant, because sometimes we do have those questions. But anyway, we are in the book of Proverbs. It is in book 2. Proverbs is the 20th book of the Old Testament, the third in the poetry section that we have been dealing with in this series. We've gone through the law, which is the first 5, then the history, all the way through the captivity and some of the return. With Ezra and Nehemiah, we've discussed Job. We have discussed Psalms. We did that in 4 weeks. I was interested when Bill first told me of this series. I want to know how Dave does Psalms in a short chapter, and it was a good chapter. But we did it in 4 weeks. That was quite the feat to do 150 chapters. We read it all, Dave. We read it all. And so now we are in the book of Proverbs, and Proverbs is a book filled with godly advice for everyday living. Proverbs is one of those books where you can go back, and even though the Old Testament isn't our law today, you can see a lot of truths that carry forward into the New Testament. These are godly advice, wisdom that transcends ages. It's true. It was true when Solomon wrote it. I gave away an answer later. And it is true today. And I hope we'll get a taste of what Proverbs is going to be talking about throughout this study. This will be about another 4-week study of the book of Proverbs. And Proverbs, just like Psalms, is quoted in the New Testament. We're gonna get one of those. We're going to start with Jeff. Jeff, do you want to get Romans chapter 3, verse 15? And Gloria can get Proverbs chapter 1, verse 16. So let's go to Romans chapter 3, verse 15.
Romans 3:15.
15.
Their feet are swift to shed blood.
That's a very short verse, and we're ripping into the context, and we're not going to discuss the content of Romans 3. But what I want you to notice, that's a very short verse, seemingly a verse that we could just pass by with. We might examine it, but we might not recognize it until we go to Proverbs 1:16. So, Gloria, you want to get Proverbs chapter 1, verse 16.
For their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood.
So Paul is paraphrasing Proverbs chapter 1. Remember, the people in the New Testament times, we say that they didn't have the New Testament, or at least as it was being written, they had pieces of the New Testament, but not the whole New Testament. But let's remember, they did have Scripture. When we read of the Bereans searching the Scriptures daily, they had some New Testament Scriptures, but they had the Old Testament there. The Old Testament, which spoke of Jesus Christ, which spoke of the coming Messiah, which could be compared to what Paul was preaching. They had that, and Paul, throughout his books, scatters Old Testament references from Psalms and from Proverbs and from Isaiah, and all of these different writers use the Old Testament, which should tell us something. We stand firm in what the Scriptures teach, that the old law was done away with, that it was removed and replaced by the law of Christ. But that doesn't mean it's useless for us. The writers of the New Testament used the Old Testament to show what they were preaching. In other words, the Old Testament still has value. Yes, it is not our law, but it still has value for us. And so let's not abandon it, thinking, well, that's just a bunch of names, a bunch of history. It's the law of Moses. I don't have to know about the law of Moses to be a Christian. And no, we don't have to know all the intricate details of the law of Moses. But if you take away the law of Moses, you're going to miss a lot of fulfillment in the New Testament. You're going to miss a lot of the shadows becoming images. Because that's what the book of Hebrews tells us. It's a lot of shadows. And now they're not shadows anymore. So let's get into the book itself. We'll start with the origin of the book of Proverbs. And if I can get my clicker to work, there we go. the origin of the book of Proverbs, we always start dealing with the title of Proverbs. And if you read the material, you'll know what we're talking about. But let's get Proverbs 1, verse 1. I think we're to Tim now. So Proverbs chapter 1, verse 1.
The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel.
Okay, so the Hebrew Old Testament designates the book according to its opening word, which is Proverbs. Dave always puts these Greek and Hebrew words in there, and I can never say them properly. But Dave, I'm sure Dave can. But it's Mashal Shalom, or something like. It's the Proverbs of Solomon. Mashal meaning Proverbs, and then Solomon. It's the Proverbs of Solomon, as we read in Proverbs 1. The Septuagint gives it a Greek title, Paromai Salmontos, Proverbs or Parables of Solomon. And then the Latin Vulgate is Liber Proverborium, the book of Proverbs. And so altogether, we have the book as titled as Proverbs. What is a proverb?
It's a wise saying.
It's a wise sayings. It's a collection of wise sayings. Since the Septuagint sometimes calls it the parables of Solomon, what's a parable? We usually think of them when we talk about Jesus. What's a parable?
Can we use the thought of Jesus?
Yeah, well, we certainly can.
It's a worldly comparison,
It's a-
story with a spiritual.
Yes. Parables are usually told in stories, or at least that's how we think of them when we think of the parables of Jesus. But the word parable is actually just a comparison. It can be any comparison that we want to talk about, whether it's in story form or not. It's the same as parables. It's a book of wise sayings, or it is a comparison between two things. And the parables we read of in the Bible usually have a deeper spiritual meaning than just what their actual meaning is. So the title is pretty self-explanatory, being a book of wise sayings. So that's what we're going to find all the way through. Which brings us to the author, who wrote a lot of the book of Solomon, or book of Proverbs. I just said it, Solomon. Tim read it. But let's go to Proverbs 10. Annie, you want to get Proverbs 10, verse 1.
The Proverbs of Solomon, a wise child believes a glad father, but a foolish child a mother's grief.
So, just like what Tim read in Proverbs 1, the Proverbs of Solomon, Annie just read in Proverbs 10:1, the Proverbs of Solomon, and then that was the beginning of his saying. Why do you believe Solomon was a good person to write a book of wise sayings? Besides the fact that God inspired him. I'm leaving that aside. Why would he have been a good choice or a good author? Think about what he asked for.
He asked for wisdom, how to rule his people.
He-
Wisdom is, that's what the Proverbs is all about. Wise sayings, wise things, how to heed instruction.
Sure. And what Cal is referring to is found in 1 Kings. So let's go to 1 Kings chapter 3. Henry, why don't you get verses 4 to 7, and Cherry, do you want to get verses 8 and 9 of 1 Kings chapter 3? So 1 Kings 3, Henry, if you can get 4 to 7, and Cherry, verses 8 and 9.
Now the king went to Regillah to sacrifice her, and there was a great high place Solomon offered the surrender offering in that hour. And at giving, the Lord appeared to Solomon, dream by light, God ask, what shall I give you? And Solomon said, you have shown great mercy to the servant David, thy father, as he walked before you in truth, righteousness, and in uprightness of heart. You have continued the great kindness for him. You have given him a son to sit on this throne. This day. Now, O Lord, my God, you have made your servant the king instead of my father. I am a little child, do not know how to go out or come in.
We saw this here among the people who have chosen great people who never come over. So give your parents sorrow this descendants. Descendant God to form your people and
Solomon here is a young man. We sometimes can miss that point from just reading through the scriptures. Solomon is a young man here. David died. Solomon was made king. And you might consider, if you were a younger person, to be in charge of a nation would be a pretty daunting task, because you do not have the experience. You do not have all of the tools that you need because you are so young. And in fact, a lot of times young people are despised by older people for being young. And they think, well, this person shouldn't be in charge because there's got to be someone better than that. And that's a problem sometimes young people have to face. And the reverse could be true. Young people could say that about older people, and neither side should take that side. But Solomon here was asked by God, you can have whatever you want. Ask it and I will give it to you. That's a question, or that's a statement that we don't get from God. God, it blesses us, but he has never come to me and said, ask anything and I'll give it to you. Solomon could have asked for what? The Lord basically said it later, but what Solomon have asked for?
Material wealth.
Material wealth. That would have been one thing. What else? What's everyone afraid of?
women.
Pardon me?
Women.
Oh, well, he could have asked for that.
He got it.
Yeah, he received that. He could have asked for that. But what's everyone afraid of? Whatever, as you get older, you start to fear this more. Death. He could have asked to live a long time. He could have asked for, since he was king, that all of his enemies would either, like as far as either he'd live in peace or his enemies would be killed at the hand of God. That there would be no wars. He could have asked for any of those things. But he asked for wisdom. He asked for an understanding heart. I like the way the King James Version puts it in verse 9. Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people. He asked for what was better. He knew of his deficiencies. He knew he was a young man. And so he asked for what he needed. Not maybe what he wanted, but what he needed. Bill, did you have something?
I just saw how much of that could be accredited to his father.
Mm-hmm.
David.
Yeah. Yeah, and like as far as he saw his father, he knew what his father. He knew of his father's reputation, how his father followed God, and he wanted to do the same. And so, like, this requires a lot of what I call reflection. Sometimes we're afraid of reflection. We're afraid to sit down. Okay, what can I do better, or what is wrong with what I am doing? maybe what is right with what I'm doing, like as far as there's positive and negative reflection. Solomon, I believe, reflected about what he needed. As a young man, he needed wisdom. He needed to have an understanding heart, to judge the people of Israel properly, to get them so that they would follow him as he followed God. And so he asked for wisdom. And so, as the writer of the book of Proverbs, Solomon is a very apt person. As we said before when we discussed Psalms, David was a musician. And so he was very apt to write a lot of the Psalms, because Psalms are songs. Well, Proverbs are wise sayings. Solomon was a wise man. Very apt for him to write it. In fact, we won't get it, but 1 Kings 4 verse 32 says he wrote over 3,000 Proverbs and 1,005 songs. We only have 31 chapters of the book of Proverbs. But remember, each chapter has many proverbs in it. We divide up chapters into chapters and verses, and books into chapters and verses. And if you read the book of Proverbs, you're going to get many proverbs in each chapter. Do we have all 3,000? No. But we have a lot of them. And they're very good sayings. But, just as Solomon wrote most of the book of Proverbs, the book of Proverbs tells us that at least he didn't copy all of the Proverbs and that there were more. Let's go to Proverbs 25. I think we're to Sandra at the back. Proverbs 25, verse 1.
These are also Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied.
So, chapter 25 begins, these are also Proverbs of Solomon, but they were copied by the scribes under the direction of Hezekiah. And so, do we remember who Hezekiah was? Before we just assume that. Who was Hezekiah? He was a king of Judah. Does anyone remember about how far removed from Solomon? How many years? About 200 years removed from Solomon. And so, what were the kings of Judah supposed to do if they were following God properly? This has been brought out before. What were they supposed to do concerning the law and the scriptures that they had? They were to obey them, but they were to copy them too. They were to copy out the law. And it was not only so that they knew the law and they followed the law. That's one reason why. But so that it didn't disappear. The scriptures we don't have a problem with them disappearing. We have copies today. Not the originals. We don't have the originals, but we have copies of the originals. In Greek and in Hebrew, we have copies. And when you compare those copies, we can have confidence that we have what actually the original said because of the copies agreeing with each other. And so Proverbs 25 says, these are Proverbs of Solomon, but these were copies made under the direction of Hezekiah by the scribes at that time. But we also do have Jeff, before we go on.
Before we get too far from the discussion of the wisdom that God gave to Solomon, it's good to keep in mind, and I'm sure it's going to come up later in the study, wisdom and obedience are not the same thing.
No.
And as much as he had great wisdom, his obedience became lacking at some point. And neither one, even, to have obedience but not to have some form of wisdom is not good either. Mm-hmm. So always remember to have that wisdom and obedience at the same time.
The wisdom should bring us to obedience. Doesn't always, you're right. It doesn't always bring us to obedience. And in fact, if you read the book of Proverbs and you say, if only Solomon listened to what he wrote, some of the times he would have been in a lot better place. But we will get into that discussion a little bit later. So I won't comment too much on that. But the first 29 chapters we attribute to Solomon. But there are the last two chapters, or at least the majority of the last two chapters, that that is written that other people wrote this. And so we are to Leister. If you want to get Proverbs 30, verse 1.
The way of Adam is uncle Jacob is not Chavez. His name declared I feel
Okay, you got the names there. I'm sorry, Leister. But who wrote Proverbs 30? Agur, or it depends how you say it. And I think, if I remember, Dave's book had another name depending on the version. But there's another man. It's not Solomon. And we don't, I'm not going to say we don't know that yet because we're not going to get to the date just yet. But nothing else is known about this man. We don't read about him in 1st or 2nd Kings or 1st or 2nd Chronicles like we do the children of Asaph or some of the other writers of the book of Psalms. We don't know where this man was or who this man was. But obviously God inspired him and it was included in his inspired book. So we should not discount it just because we don't know who this person was. And so Agur, the son of Jacob, wrote this chapter. And then let's skip ahead to the last chapter. Proverbs 31. And Dave, do you want to get Proverbs 31, verse 1?
The words of King Lemuel, the utterance which his mother taught him.
There's a lot of discussion about who King Lemuel was. But King Lemuel wrote at least part of this chapter, depending on if you believe he wrote about the virtuous woman later. But later in this chapter. But he wrote at least part of this chapter. Some people think that this was another name for Solomon. I don't know. So Dave has in his book that he was possibly a northern Arabian who worshipped the true God. Again, I don't know. I can't prove either one. There was a king, his name was Lemuel, and he wrote this chapter. We again don't have to know everything about every author. Unlike some of the books where we sort of guess who could have wrote it, like Genesis to Deuteronomy or 1st and 2nd Samuel, as to whether Samuel wrote the whole book. Well, he died in one of the books. Well, who wrote the rest? Proverbs tells us. Proverbs tells us who wrote it, who they are attributed to, and so we don't have to guess as to who they are. We just don't know many of the details on these last two men. Any comments about the authors before we move on? It brings us, Dave, this is our favorite section of the entire series. The date. Now, we don't have to speculate as much as we do with some of the dates because we know who the authors were. And so Solomon lived at around 971 to 931. He reigned 40 years. Somewhere in that time period, he wrote these Proverbs. Whether it was early in his life, later in his life, and I think we can see a difference maybe between some of the Proverbs that maybe were earlier as opposed to some that were later. But that would be in this time period here. Hezekiah reigned at around 700. 700 is just after the fall of Israel. Israel would have fallen in 722 BC. We are still just about 200 years from the fall of Judah. Judah would fall between 606 and 586 BC, if we remember our dates. So we're in 700 BC. We're still 200 years from the fall of Judah. But Israel has already fallen. Samaria has fallen in 722. So most of the book of Proverbs written in that time. The dates of the last two chapters, which were written by Agur and King Lemuel, is uncertain. But since the scribes of Hezekiah copied and edited most of the book, it was probably finished by that time. This book would have been in existence when the children of Judah were taken into captivity. This book would have been completed by then. So even though we don't know the dates of the absolute dates of the last two chapters, we can probably fairly be certain that it's around 700, that it was at least written. Whether it could be 200 years in between, we don't know. But they were there. That's the date. And that's how quickly we usually go through the date. Which brings us to our last thing that we will discuss this morning, is the purpose of Proverbs. And we're just going to be dealing with the historical section. We are getting exactly where I want to be for this week, so that's good. So we usually have the historical section, we have the doctrinal section, we have how it relates to Jesus Christ, and we have some other points that go along with the book. And so the purpose of the historical section is what? What do you think the purpose of Proverbs is? We've sort of already discussed some of it, but why did God include a book that had wise sayings or proverbs? Why do you think? Jeff?
People to this point have certainly showed a need for wisdom. God's supplying something they need.
Yeah. He's applying something they need, and it was God's wisdom that he was giving them. There's a lot. Remember what Paul talks about wisdom. And a lot of the times when Paul's talking about wisdom, he's talking about man's wisdom versus God's wisdom. And how we can't say we are wise and not have God's wisdom. Because we are not wise. We might have knowledge, but there is a difference even between wisdom and obedience as knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge, I can know anything I want to. I can read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and I could know what it says, but not have wisdom. I have knowledge, but I don't have wisdom. Wisdom would teach me that I have to obey it. Knowledge just is a book. I can quote whatever verse in the Bible. There are a lot of people who have biblical knowledge, but don't have biblical wisdom. But the Proverbs themselves give us sort of a reason in the first chapter. So let's go back. Kala, do you want to get Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 through 4?
The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the naive, to the youth knowledge and discretion.
So what's the, we might say, the preface, the introduction to the book of Proverbs? What was the reason that Proverbs was written? Why did Solomon write it? Verse 2 says to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive words of understanding, to receive instruction. This goes to what Jeff said, that they needed to receive instruction. Up to this point, maybe excluding Psalms, we've had a lot of stories that teach us the principles of God. We have the law of Moses written in Leviticus that teach us what the law says. But up until this point, we have a narrative. And Psalms gives us how to worship God. Proverbs sort of gives us an idea of how to obey God wisely. And so this book provides us wisdom in justice, in judgment, and in equity. What do those three words mean to you? Justice, judgment, and equity. I can sum them up probably in one word. Love. If I love my brethren, I'm going to be just as God is just. Judgment, I'm going to judge righteously because I love my brethren. And I'm going to treat each one equally because I love my brethren. And I love my neighbor in the world. This book's teaching us about that. How to be just. God is just. How is God just? How can we be just? God's judgment is perfect. Our judgment is not always perfect. We have imperfect judgment because the difference between us and God is we can't know the hearts of men and women. God can. And that's why his judgment is far superior to ours. because he knows the actual reason why someone has done something. He can peer into the hearts of men and know if they're really doing what they say they're doing or whether they're just putting on a show for people. And so God's judgment is perfect. That's why we can have confidence in the judgment that is to come, because God knows us. We're not going to be judged unfairly. If we receive heaven, it's because of God's grace and because we have received God's grace. It's not going to be because we fooled God. It's not going to be because of that at all. And if we don't receive heaven, it's because we haven't received God's grace. It's because we haven't done what God has said. And it's going to be right. We go to court, and sometimes the person who actually committed the crime gets off, is found not guilty of the crime because there was not enough evidence, or because the jury was fooled. There's not going to be that situation. God's judgment is perfect. And equity. We are to treat every one of our brethren the same way we would want to be treated. But we should not have favorites. We should not show respect of persons. God does not show respect of persons. If anyone in this world, no matter who they are, deserve our best treatment. And so these proverbs are going to show us how to have wisdom, how to have understanding, how to be just, how to have righteous judgment, how to treat people equally, and how to use discretion. Sometimes that's a word that we don't often use either. Sometimes we forget that, yes, there are things that have to be done. There are ways to say it. You can be discreet sometimes. You don't always have to be the most loud person or say things so bluntly. Sometimes it's better to use discretion when discretion is called for. And this book is going to lead us to that. Bill, do you want to get verses 8 and 9 of chapter 1?
8 and 9?
Yes.
I want to go there. Hear, my son, your father's instruction. Do not forsake your mother's teaching. Indeed, they are a graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck.
So what I'm getting from these verses is that most of the Proverbs are presented in the form of instruction, in teaching form. And who is he instructing? It's interesting here. Who is he instructing?
His children.
His children. What's one of the what? It's interesting here if you think about Solomon's children. Who was Solomon's most famous child? Who would be king next? Rehoboam would be king next. Did Rehoboam show wisdom when he became king? No, he did not. He did not show wisdom. He did not heed his father's teachings here, his father's instructions. And that's just an interesting thing. And we all know what happened to Rehoboam. The kingdom was torn in two because he did not act wisely. He did not follow the instruction of the people he should have been following the instruction of. Proverbs was written to Solomon's children, or at least some of them are. And it says, hear the instruction of your father, but it's not just hear the instruction of your father. Do not forsake the law of your mother. Fathers, yes, they lead the house, but mothers are just as important too. There's the law of their mother. In other words, listen to your parents. Listen to your parents, both your father and your mother. Why? According to verse 9, why?
There will be blessings for us.
There will be blessings for us. They shall be an ornament of grace unto your head and chains around your neck. So there's two reasons. There'll be an ornament of grace on your head, but it will also lead you to do what is right, as far as it'd be chains in that sense. We think of chains. There might be necklaces. Might think of it that way. Or it could be chains as far as we think of shackles sometimes when we think of chains. But it's good for you. Sometimes it's good to be restrained. Sometimes it's not good not to be restrained. In other words, just to live any old way we want. How many times do children think their parents know nothing, and then they go out and live freely in the world, and they get themselves into trouble? And they find out, my mom and dad were right. I should have lived this way. Sometimes it's good to have boundaries that our parents set for us. Our parents aren't setting those boundaries because they hate us or they want to be mean to us. They want to protect us. They want us to know that the world is not just a place where everything good will happen to you. Look both ways before you cross the street. So one of the basic things we teach children when they're young. Look both ways before you cross the street. Well, I don't like that. My parents are dumb. I'm just going to go. And you hit by a car because you didn't look both ways. That's just a simple thing. There's a lot of, we don't like curfews, or we don't like this or that. Parents do things to protect us. But parents should also be instructing us in the ways of the Lord. We should not be, there are some reasons why we don't do things is because God said those are wrong. And so we should be teaching that as well. But children, listen to your parents. It's a 2-minute bell. Let's go to Proverbs 3, just before we run out of time. And I'm going to read verses 1 through 6 of Proverbs 3. My son, forget not my law, but let thine heart keep my commandments. For length of days and long life and peace shall they add to you. Let not mercy and truth forsake you. Bind them about thy neck. Write them upon the table of your heart. So shall you find favor and good understanding in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not upon thine own understanding. In all ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. So, the Proverbs again educated God's covenant people in principles to enable them to live a virtuous, productive, and meaningful life in connection with their relationship to God. That's what we can gain from Proverbs. That's what one of the historical purpose of Proverbs was. We can gain those same truths. If you want to know how to be a virtuous person, read Proverbs. Virtuous woman is the last bit of Proverbs, but virtue is found all the way through. Productive. You want to know how to be productive? Read Proverbs. You want to know how to obey God? Read Proverbs. You want to learn how to avoid some of the pitfalls in this life? Read Proverbs. It's an important book, and it's a book that we will gain a little bit more understanding as we go along.